Welcome back to Psychology Applied to Work. This is Lecture 12, Individual Differences at Work. All right, in Lecture 11, we talked about interviewing, and specifically we talked about unstructured versus structured interviews, and then we got into what do we mean by a structured interview, and we talked about situational behavioral interviews. We also talked about other interview types. We talked about other selection factors, and we talked about an example of a typical workflow of posting a position to filtering through potential candidates, determining who should be interviewing, do the interviewing process, do the scoring to the all the way to the job offer. And then we talked about some ways in which you can improve your odds in an interview, where we talked about what it would mean to be a great interviewee. Well, today is another bonus lecture for extra credit, which if you looked at what the test results were for Unit 1, you saw that this extra credit can be a very big factor in boosting your grade. So we certainly encourage you to listen to this lecture and provide some feedback of what you thought was insightful or confusing or both. So today we're going to talk about individual differences at work, and we're going to talk about what do we mean by that. What are the ways in which difference manifests? What are those dimensions? And obviously we're going to talk about personality, one of the most obvious differences between people. But we're also going to talk about the way people's cognition seems to be different, and how psychology has looked at things called cognitive styles. But we'll also talk about life experiences, and we'll talk about neurodiversity. All right, so I'd like to frame this lecture properly so that you can see the value of it. You're going to have a long career, either at one place or 17 different places. You know, things might go fantastic for you, or things might be a roller coaster. But chances are, almost all of the things that you encounter at work that were very helpful for you, or very disappointing or stressful, the things that caused you a lot of consternation, that felt like big obstacles, a lot of those will relate to people, specifically to your interactions with people and your success or failure at finding common ground with somebody else, somebody that maybe has decision rights, or authority, or otherwise maybe it's somebody that's working for you, but you're responsible, and your career advancement is dependent upon how successful your team is. And you'll discover that people are difficult to understand, and oftentimes you can find yourself in a kind of conflict with somebody that is based upon an inability to see things the same way, a lack of common frame of reference, or inconsistent axioms, which is sort of the assumptions that both parties are bringing to a discussion. It also can be, some in-group, out-group stuff where, you have a binding narrative to a particular sort of emerging implicit in-group, and another person is attached to a different in-group, and as a result, you both are predisposed to not see each other's perspective. And within organizations, there absolutely are, subgroups and sub-in-groups and out-groups. And in fact, office politics, and especially in large corporations, you can have all sorts of fiefdoms and camps and cliques and that sort of thing, where you find yourself, not being heard, or you actually are biased and you're not hearing another person. So anyway, that often causes a lot of frustration, a lot of inefficiency. And one way that you can help improve your odds in these encounters is if you have a language and a framework for how people are different. Yeah, even if it's just to keep you from getting frustrated or angry that they're not thinking the way you're thinking, and before you sort of attach motives that may not be true, like this person's out to get me or this person's a liar, those before you apply malice in your mind to somebody's intent, before you say that somebody has malicious intent. Maybe you ought to think about, maybe I just don't understand this person very well. Maybe I don't understand this person's perspective. And by understanding difference better, by recognizing that differences are vast, and by having a vocabulary and a framework to dimensionalize difference, it can really help you. And so it's been very helpful in my career. It continues to be in terms of being able to not get upset in certain situations, but at the same time to be able to retune my approach when I'm dealing with somebody. And it is kind of a lifelong journey, if you will, because try as we might to dimensionalize all the aspects of difference, it eludes us. But the kinds of dimensions I will share today in this lecture are ones that I think you will find are very useful if you hold on to them not too tightly and recognize that they are inexact and inelegant, and that because they are defined and explicit, they are therefore a reduction. They are therefore not a true representation of how complex things really are. So as long as you don't look at them as like 100% predictive dimensions, and instead look at them as useful ways to get some perspective on where this person might be coming from, they can be very valuable. So with that in mind, let's get going. So what are these dimensions of difference for people? So obviously there are lots of them. The first one that is sort of the most glaring because of the work context is, how well people do the job. What are people's differences in their abilities? What is their competence in this specific job? A lot is tied to this. A lot of performance management is tied to how well you do the job, and attempts are made to try to define what it means to be competent, to have abilities that relate to the job, and we have, and we will continue to talk a lot about those ways of defining what is a good job performance. So that's the most obvious thing, is people have differences in their competence levels and abilities, and it isn't just you are or not competent at your job. Usually your job itself involves all sorts of KSAOs, and you might have a lot of competence or ability in one or two aspects and maybe some gaps in some others. And so it can, there's turtles all the way down, so to speak, as you try to disambiguate this. You get further and further detail of what do you really mean by competent at what. But I think everybody generally gets the idea, and this is first and foremost in people's minds when they're working with other people and they're counting on those people to do work for them, is how well do they do the job. There's also, again, it depends on the workplace, but how does somebody respond to stress? How resilient is this person? This can take the form of how many hours they can work, what their overall workload capacity. But there are many jobs where there are physical elements to them besides sitting at a laptop, which sitting for 8+ hours a day is not a trivial thing, and is not exactly healthy for you either. But a lot of jobs involve standing on your feet, lifting and moving, and obviously there's differences in people's physicality that affects how well they can do certain aspects of the job. Obviously, there's also differences in intelligence. There's differences in how well people can remember things. The ability to remember names and faces, and in what a person's background is, and what their kids' names are, and where they are in school, and to be able to reestablish those connections with people that you haven't seen in a long time. That is really a powerful skill. It's not a skill that I possess. I have to work really hard at well, if I wanted to be really good at remembering people's names and faces, I have to work very, very hard. As it is, I can't say that I do work very, very hard at this. I kind of just accept that names and faces, connections of them are more difficult for me. I remember faces really well, names not so much, but I don't connect the faces with the names or the context. So I just see a lot of people and go, I know that person somehow. But everybody's different here, and somebody with a keen memory, and you might be that person, but if you're not, you sure know people that are those people, and as you enter a career and move along in your career, you'll see how powerful it is for making connections and establishing connections. And I would certainly encourage you to work on that skill regardless of what your level is. And then intelligence. There are obviously many dimensions to intelligence. We talked about G factor a little bit, and we also talked about how intelligence is but one factor. Now, it is a powerful factor compared to the other factors, but it's still a weak factor in the sense that it is hardly the majority factor. But being highly intelligent, all other dimensions equal, is generally an advantage. But sometimes when people are highly intelligent, their life is easier, and often they can sort of hack their way through life because they're smart, and they don't always develop the kinds of habits that make them more organized and effective. And oftentimes somebody that might not be quite as intelligent but has developed really good habits can run circles around a really smart person. So again, these are things we all understand. We know what it is to be smart or not, and we know what it is to remember or not. But none of these are determinants. And if you're high on one and low on another, that doesn't set your life story. These things are many and varied and interacting. So anyway, let's keep going. Social skills, obviously. And then, we could talk a long time about what do we really mean by social skills. There's an empathy element to this. There's understanding norms. There's a willingness to follow norms. There's a ability to listen well and to not be rude or inconsiderate, and all sorts of dimensions to social skills. And if you're somebody like me, as an autistic person and an engineer, these are things you build up slowly over time, and you always have to work at it. And social skills are never automatic for me. They are always things that I'm kind of running through a rule book in my head, and sometimes I'm tired or just don't have it in me, and so I end up being a rude or arrogant person in terms of how somebody might perceive me. Whereas other people, you know them, you might be them. They just love people. They just get people. They just kind of understand somebody's emotional state, and they just have a nice back and forth, and that is a really big advantage, just like being able to remember names and faces. Social skills are huge. If your social skills are great, continue to try to make them better. If your social skills are like mine, still recognize how important they are, and make it your mission to do what you can to continually, even if it's just slowly, but to continually try to improve that. Personality, and we're going to talk quite a bit today about personality and the ways that they've been dimensionalized. And it's kind of a big grab bag term. It has more specific meaning within personality psychology, obviously, and we'll get into that. But I mean, everybody understands what the word personality is at some level. It's sort of a catch-all for the way people behave, how they act. That isn't quite capturable by things like competence or ability or intelligence. And there's work styles, and there's even things like, are you a morning person? Do you tend to get all of your stuff done right away? Do you tend to want to only work on one thing, or do you like to work on a bunch of things in chunked times? There's also obviously a lot of biases that people have, and that's its own giant bucket of stuff. And then there's the standard categories of manifestable diversity that people often think of when you just hear the term diversity before you define it more specifically to mean other things, like, there's certainly diversity of personality, there's certainly diversity of social skills, there's certainly diversity of competence, but generally speaking, age, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and the like, level of abilities that relate to disabilities, those sorts of things. Socioeconomics is big. We know quite quickly when we get to know people, where they are, so to speak, at some level in a socioeconomic ladder. We almost can't help ourselves because people often end up subtly or overtly signaling it in their clothes and car and some cases manner of speaking. It's less in America, and in fact, in the United States has a culture where people aren't supposed to signal too strongly, but in certainly other cultures, it can be very overt and well established in the culture, for better or for worse. But we all certainly understand that people come from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and people, there's the background that you're in, sort of this, what is your socioeconomic status right now? That's important in terms of how it might affect your decisions. If you have a lot of money, you might look at risk in your career a little bit differently than if you're desperate to pay bills, and that'll affect your work stress, and that'll affect your work decisions. But it isn't just what is your socioeconomic status now. Your socioeconomic status that you grew up in can be quite formative as well, and can can affect how you think about decisions and risk, and in some cases how you handle yourself and the ways you signal. And then there's different things of ways of thinking, and we're going to talk about one element of it today when we talk about cognitive styles, and that's certainly not the only way of looking at this, but it is a way in personality literature that it's been defined. And obviously there's other dimensions, and we're not going to cover each one of these here. We're going to cover a few of these in the interest of time. I mean, this lecture could be a semester-long class if it really wanted it to be, and we probably would still have a lot of material when we were done. All right, we are going to talk about personality for the next few slides. We're going to mostly talk about traits, and trait is, so there's ways of looking at this, and one way that used to be sliced was traits versus type. A type was like, you're this kind of person, and you'll still hear like, you're a type A personality, or you're a type B personality, and there are two buckets for things. There's two kinds of people in this world: those that believe there's two kinds of people, and those that don't. That's a joke. Anyway, there are older personality schools of thought, so to speak, that played with types, and then there's sort of folk psychology and shall we say non-scientific approaches that like to bucketize people into types. We are talking traits, and traits are dimensions of behavior, and they are about tendencies, not determination. It doesn't mean if you have a particular trait that therefore means you're going to behave a certain way. What it means is, in general, on average, you'll tend to behave, if you're high in a trait, tend to behave a little differently in that dimension than people that are low in that trait. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So traits are tendencies. They do not firmly predict individual situations. They are reasonable predictors across the average of lots of situations. So how does that show up? And we'll use an example here in extroversion. If you are high in extroversion, if you are an extrovert, if you are an off-the-charts extrovert, that doesn't mean that in every social situation you're going to act extroverted. There's plenty of times in which the right thing to do is to be quiet. You're sitting in a classroom, you're at a movie theater, you just don't care, or you're in a place where if you act up, speak up, call attention to yourself, bad things will happen. I mean, being extroverted does not mean that you have some sort of uncontrollable compulsion to act up, act out, call attention to yourself. It might mean that those things are things you're comfortable with. It might be that those things are things you like to some extent, but that is situationally based. So if you're high in extroversion, that doesn't mean that most of the time you're going to be extroverted. Rather what it means is, if you're high in extroversion, is that over a subset of lots of situations, you will tend to act in a more engaging way socially than somebody that scores really low in extroversion, somebody that's an introvert. So if you get a group of introverts and get a group of extroverts, and then you secretly track them in all their social situations, you'll see lots of times in which introverts act in an extroverted way in a particular situation. And you'll find times when extroverts tend to be reticent, or generally quiet. But it does mean that across all of the situations, the extroverts will tend to act in a more socially engaging way, more than the introverts. So it's a predictor on the average, but it is a lousy predictor for a given situation. So another way of looking at that, and this prediction, in that even people who are strong extroverts have plenty of times in which they don't act extroverted. If you follow somebody high in extroversion throughout their daily life for weeks on end, and sort of made a plot for all the times they had a social interaction and scored it for were they extroverted or not, and you came up with a distribution curve of what that would look like, and it would probably be kind of like a skewed distribution. And it might skew a little bit towards the extroverted, but there would be plenty of places in the distribution tail that would be in the introverted space. And if you did the same thing with introverts and tracked them in all their situations, and then were able to make a scoring of those in a distribution, you would find probably a slightly skewed distribution that was slightly more skewed towards non-extroverted behavior. But if you actually looked at them and you looked at how much variation there was, and then you compared it to how much variation there was across all people, you would find that the behavior varies more, within the person than person to person. Which is to say, that if you're extroverted, you're going to be introverted a lot, and that amount of variation is actually more than the amount of variation there is across the larger population. It's kind of hard to explain that without graphs, and we don't have a lot of time, but I think you get the general idea here, that this is about predictability across multiple situations. Now, another thing to talk about when it comes to personality and work is you very well may encounter at some point in your career where your organization has decided that they want to help with interpersonal understanding, and they'll give you some training, or a consultant will come in, or your boss will talk about something, where you'll find personality is talked about at work. But sometimes it is, more often than not, it's not the ways that personality is dimensionalized within the literature. Usually it's a very simplified version of it. And so you get often these for-profit companies that consult with organizations, and they've got their questionnaire, and then they have their own names for traits, and some of them even have where they group people into types. And some of those are okay. Some of them are based upon reasonably scientific efforts, and where they might not use the exact names of the traits we're going to talk about, but they're analogous. But again, they want to make them their own so that they have something that's differentiatable as a business. Because if you're going to bill somebody thousands of dollars to come in and talk to your people about personality, and in the end you're just giving information that what you could have gotten at Wikipedia, people tend not to want to pay money for that. And there's a rationale why you would want somebody with expertise to talk about personality at work, even if they are talking about things that are in Wikipedia. There's lots of good reasons for that, but it is a more difficult sell. But if you have the secret sauce, so to speak, if you can present your business as, we've been doing this for decades and decades, and we have, thousands of clients, and we've done this test to 500,000 workers, and we've tracked it to performance. In some cases, those things are real, and in some cases they do have sort of their own canned data, and that is a sort of a secret sauce. So the trouble is, it's hard to separate the good ones from the bad ones, and there are some ones that are not so sciencey. Okay, so what we're going to talk about for personality is the 5-factor model, because it has the most support in the literature, because it is the closest thing to a consensus within personality psychology. Now you probably remember at least some elements of this from your introductory psychology class. You may have heard these terms: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness/intellect. You may have heard them as like OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, because that's a way to remember the terms. What I would suggest that you do is try to remember them as EACNO, EACNO, E-A-C-N-O, because in that order, extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness intellect, that is the order by which they most strongly show up in their effect size in experiments. So extroversion is sort of the easiest one to tease out in an experiment to show that extroverted people or introverted people do behave differently. And then it gets a little bit harder as you go along from agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness intellect is the squirreliest one. It's the hardest one. It has the weakest effect size in experiments. They all 5 are well supported in the literature, as these are dimensions that consistently emerge where people do seem to behave differently across these 5 dimensions. And when you can sort people along these dimensions, it does give you a certain amount of predictive capability across a lot of situations. Another way of looking at personality is kind of a thing that helps you find your niche, or constrains you into certain niches. People still debate exactly, how does one's personality form, and to what extent is one's personality plastic? To what extent can your personality shift? And certainly you can have transformations in personality. Generally speaking, your personality generally stays fairly consistent, even though it might manifest in different ways. If you're super open, what you were open about when you were 10 is not necessarily what the kind of novelty that you might seek when you're 50. The ways you acted extroverted when you were 12 is probably different than the ways you act when you're extroverted when you're 30. But generally speaking, personalities are fairly stable. That said, there are certainly ways in which they can drift, and there are certain ways in which you can choose to do or not do certain behaviors that at least outwardly seems to change some of your personality dimensions. But your personality is somewhat of a determinant of how people with other personalities are interacting with you, and the kinds of things you really like or are really good at, so to speak, can help you find niches. If you are really, really high in openness, and novelty is a good thing, and change is a good thing, and you're in an environment where you do the same thing every day, and you're supposed to do it the exact same, because your high quality and repetitiveness are the name of the day at your job. Maybe that's not going to be something that you're going to do well at or like. So to some extent, what your personality is can constrain and define and help you find your niche. All right, now we are going to go through the 5 factors at a high level, and I'm going to describe them. I'm going to describe the five factors lightly, but I'm going to describe them across their full dimension, and I'm going to do it from a point of view of diversity as a source of wisdom of the crowd, and how different personalities in groups actually, generally speaking, can bring positive results. Not always, but I'll talk about how if you're on one end of a personality dimension or another, that shows up in good ways and bad ways in social interactions at a high level. So let's get into that. So extroversion. So we're starting with the one that has the highest effect sizes, and I've got on each one of these slides there'll be a dimensional line on the bottom of somebody that's really high on one side or somebody who's really low. So in this case, a super extrovert is on the right and a super introvert is on the left. And then I'm also splitting them into two different ways of describing it, and those are called aspects. Not everybody is in love with aspects. I like the Big Five aspect scale personally. I like the way the taxonomy splits into two more branches again, and there is good literature supporting the Big Five aspect scale, but some people don't like them. Some people prefer a whole bunch of them, and they call them facets. And it doesn't really matter what camp you're in. The point is that extroversion and introversion, manifest themselves in different ways. And I'm going to use the aspect scale. So in that case, extroversion manifests itself as enthusiastic behavior or assertive behavior. And really what you're looking at is how do you and to what extent do you engage in interpersonally. And do you engage interpersonally enthusiastically or assertively, or are you introverted and tend not to get enthusiastic about things? You tend to hold yourself inward, or otherwise be reticent and not assert. So enthusiasm or assertiveness, and you can think of enthusiasm as something that people perceive as affiliative, as when you're enthusiastic about something. You're positive, you're sharing positive energy. You might be enthusiastic about what somebody said or somebody's idea, or might be enthusiastic about your own idea, but you're doing it in a pro-social, positive sort of way. Yes, you can be so enthusiastic that you can be obnoxious and annoying, but I mean, generally speaking, done within reason, it's often perceived as affiliative. But being assertive, that's usually perceived, and it's usually a part of something goal-oriented. You are in a mode where you're trying to get a goal done, and humans might be tools or obstacles in your path. And if they're tools or obstacles, you're going to engage those people interpersonally to get your goal done. And if they're obstacles, you're going to assert yourself to get them out of your way. And if they're tools, you're going to assert yourself to put them to work for your goal. But, it may or may not work. People don't always respond well to assertiveness. It depends on lots of stuff situationally, like do you have authority? Do you have respect and trust? But you can think of assertiveness as an extroverted, a manifestation of extroversion that's around goal orientation. Now, introversion can be looked at as sort of indirectly pro-social, because by being introverted, you're not the one calling all the attention. You're not the one being obnoxious. You're inherently, can be perceived as listening. Depending upon on you. I mean, you can definitely be perceived as not listening, but I mean, generally speaking, quiet people, sort of bring a kind of calmness to a group, and so that. Introversion can actually calm a group down and can actually dampen out what otherwise might be contagion in a group, an information cascade. The group all gets worked up into a fervor, maybe the Salem witch trial group could have used a few more introverts, who knows? But I'm trying to give you a flavor of why being high on one or low on another, that doesn't mean that life is good or bad. It means life is different, and it doesn't mean that you have a positive or negative role in a group. It means you have a different role, and there's ways in which both of all of these dimensions can be good and bad situationally. So the other thing here on these dimensions is that most people aren't on the ends. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and to be neither highly extroverted or introverted is called being an ambivert. And then not every dimension has a name for where you are in the middle, but extroversion does. So most people are ambiverts. All right, let's talk about agreeableness. Agreeableness is the dimension on the bottom, and generally it's your agreeable or disagreeable. And if you're agreeable, using the Big Five aspect scale, that can be broken up into being polite or compassionate, And these aren't the terms. That's the terms for the Big Five Aspects scale. But on the opposite side, on the disagreeable side, I have direct and indifferent, and those aren't officially words in the literature on the Big Five Aspects scale, but they're the words that I like, that seem to be the I don't know, dialectically opposite ends of politeness and compassion in the context of agreeableness. And hopefully that'll make sense as we go here. So you can think of agreeableness as how interpersonally affiliative you are, how pro-social you are in your behavior, either via politeness or a sort of compassion/empathy subdimension. You can think of politeness as sort of modeling good normative behavior. You know, you're following the rules of society. You're being respectful and trying to prevent conflict. You're trying to have everything to be harmonious and functional, and to, by modeling that behavior, trying to get everybody else to do what you're supposed to do. You can think of compassion as a way that motivates people to be more harmonious with others. Sort of salves the wound, so to speak. That acts as a kind of glue. And that highly agreeable people tend to help bind people. And that a disagreeable person, or the disagreeableness dimension, you can think of that as a good resistor of groupthink. That you have somebody that's, you know, either direct or indifferent. That's a good way to dampen contagion. And so, you know, one way of thinking of disagreeableness is demand avoidance, which is a term that really just means these are people who don't like to be told what to do. You know, you make a demand on them, and a demand avoidance is actually can manifest as a pathological demand avoidance, which is, you know, just by telling them, just by simply asking or telling someone to do something, they aren't just indifferent; they are directly antagonistic to that goal, and they didn't care before, but now they definitely don't want to do it. And that's sort of the pathological manifestation. But generally speaking, a disagreeable person is somebody that just because you want them to do something doesn't mean that they're suddenly pro-socially motivated to do it. They're more disagreeable. They're more indifferent about it. And you can also think of it as like their empathy might not be super tuned in, super sensitive to picking up signs of empathy. That doesn't mean they lack empathy. You know, as an autistic person, I don't lack empathy. I'm sort of blind to the implicit, many of the implicit signs, and have to think it through to understand what somebody's emotional state is. And so those things, that's the empathy signals, or the social signals that would usually cue my empathy, are muted. And directness, you know, part of being a disagreeable person is you don't necessarily feel that empathy weight of, oh, I better not say this because that person will get upset. That enables a disagreeable person to tell the hard truths, and sometimes those hard truths need to be told. And so agreeable people help glue people together and bring harmony, and disagreeable people, make sure that if the emperor is walking around without any clothes, that somebody's going, hey, you know, pretty sure the emperor's naked, and maybe we ought to deal with that. So there's value in this diversity, in that overall indifference also, like the reticence of introverts. Acts as a dampening agent to cascades, which is the manias, the witch hunts, the bubbles, those sorts of things. Okay, next we're going to talk about conscientiousness. This is probably the number one thing that shows up at work in terms of obvious differentiators of people, because it manifests as how hard you work. There's much more to it, much more to conscientiousness than how hard you work. But it is very obvious at work when you see somebody that's really, really conscientious. And conscientiousness followed by agreeableness are your strongest predictors of the personality traits of success. And there's literature that's tied conscientiousness and agreeableness to better functioning teams. I'm presenting this information to highlight the value of the diversity across all of these dimensions is also valuable to teams. But there hasn't been a whole lot of literature exploring that. But there has been a little bit of group process literature in IO psychology that's looked at how well teams perform that have more agreeableness or more higher conscientiousness, which seems fairly obvious. If you have a group of hardworking people, or a group of people that really get along with other people really well, all other things being equal, might perform better. But that doesn't mean that what that group was working on might not have been something that could have had some groupthink or other types of contagion. So it's not all about how fast you come to a decision. If everybody comes to a quick decision, but that decision's bad, it's not good. It's not necessarily a good thing that the group all agreed really quickly. And so having that the give and take of other personalities to really, force more topologies to be explored, so to speak, you're less likely to have group polarization or groupthink that results in negative outcomes. So, but conscientiousness is probably the strongest thing that correlates outside of intelligence to work performance. Intelligence is a predictor, but again, it is a weak predictor. Conscientiousness is a predictor. It's a weak predictor. But intelligence and conscientiousness sort of lead the pack of a big pack of weak predictors that all add up to all of the dimensions. None of them are a majority dimension, but being really smart and being really conscientious take you a long way in most careers. If you're both, you can be quite the juggernaut. Oftentimes, if you're too high on intelligence, you end up not always being so high in conscientiousness because things were a little too easy for you growing up. That's certainly not a universal, but it does show up that way. So conscientiousness, really, you're measuring either your working behavior, your hard work, or how much you like order. So if you look at that dimension in the Big Five aspect scale, conscientiousness can manifest itself as strong predilection for maintaining predictive order, or a strong motivation to continue doing productive work. And then I have the words non-structured and lazy as their counterpoints, and we'll talk about the value of both ends here. So orderliness or industriousness. And orderliness, you can think of that as that's norm enforcement. Politeness helps to model normative behavior. Well, orderliness helps to motivate people to enforce norms. But a lot of orderliness seems to me is you're trying to create a predictive environment, trying to reduce uncertainty. You want the spice rack to be lined up and alphabetized. That way you can always find the spices. In a world in which you can't find spices is a scary world. I am only a little bit joking because there are people that are that orderly. But there's a lot of things in life that are, you can map that to that are maybe a little bit more existential than your spices. But you can think of orderliness as people who are trying to make their environment more predictive, trying to reduce uncertainty. And you can think of industriousness as strong goal-oriented, goal-directed actions. And you can think of this both as an approach motivation or an avoidance motivation. An approach motivation is a dopaminergic, dopamine. You're moving forward. It's positive orientation. It's taking action in the world with the sort of left hemispheric dominant. It's generally associated with non-negative emotion. Avoidance is generally about, hey, there's something threatening, there's something aversive, there's something uncertain, and you can be really conscientious because you're really afraid of uncertainty, and you can be really conscientious because you're super goal oriented. So both of them can motivate you to be really conscientious. Or you could have both. There are people that are super goal oriented, and super afraid of failing or unpredictable environments. And so they can be maximally motivated both for approach and avoidance. And if you find somebody that's maximally motivated on approach and avoidance for conscientiousness, those are the people you'll meet in your life that are the hardest working people you know. Because they're always got to be working on something, because they always got to be working on their goals, and they are really, really afraid of not achieving their goals, or not coming through for their obligations or whatever. And so they work extra hard to avoid that negative feeling. At the same time, they're inherently motivated. So those are the absolute unstoppable, work constantly, juggernaut human beings. And there's negatives to that too, obviously, because you literally work all your waking hours. And then people that are low in conscientiousness, There's value to that too. Those are people that don't like to do stupid stuff. They don't like useless activity. They don't like red tape. If there's a giant pile of dirt and you give them a shovel and you say, hey, I need that dirt moved from here to there. A really conscientious person might just grab the shovel, assuming you have some authority or whatever, they have a reason to do what you're saying. Might just grab the shovel and start moving the dirt one shovel at a time. And a low conscientious person might go, well, that's really stupid. You got a pickup right there. Let's back the pickup up and let's just shovel it into the pickup and then drive it over to where we need it and then dump it out or whatever. So laziness can actually be a source of innovation. So there's value to this. When a group is working on something, for the group just wastes their time, not wastes their time, but spends all their time and precious resources drudging through some work that needs to be done. Having somebody that doesn't want to do that and would prefer a different option, can actually be valuable to the group. So it's good to have people on both ends of this. Next one is neuroticism. And the Big Five aspect scale breaks this into stability. The Big Five aspect scale looks at this at the negative dimension. So look on the left. So volatility and withdrawal, to be withdrawn or withdrawal, or to be volatile. And the counter of those that I've put there is stable or sociable. And so this is really measuring how consistently negative emotion influences your behavior, either through volatility or withdrawal. Volatility, you can think of that as assertive action to deal with perceived threats, but it's more avoidance motivated. You're asserting, and at some extent that's goal oriented, but a lot of times it's like, these obstacles are threatening, so now you throw in some avoidance motivation and negative, highly motivated and aroused from the negative side of things, because you're responding to threats, and so you act in a volatile manner. Whereas withdrawal, you can think of that is also avoidance motivation, but it's more of a, I'm not going to, this obstacle isn't something I have to fight that's threatening. It's more of a, yeah, I'm just going to get out of here. I'm just, you might not be in a goal-oriented mode, and what you see isn't something that you need to get out of your way. It's just more of you need to get out of its way. So volatility and withdrawal. And other people look at this in its inverse, because neuroticism can have a negative connotation. Everybody has some level of neuroticism, but people literally get in trouble if they say things like somebody's more neurotic than another person, or one gender is more neurotic than another person, because it seems like you're making labels, and so a way to try to avoid that, that's been advocated by some, is to call it stability, is to call it by its positive, the degree to which you're not influenced by negative emotion. And that, instead of calling it an S, a lot of people use it as a negative N, so you're still stuck with the neuroticism, I guess, one way or another. A way to look at highly neurotic people is they'll often fixate on the risk and fear the downside, where somebody that's highly stable or low in neuroticism is a lot more tolerant to risk, and they often then look at the upside of things. All right, lastly, for personality, we'll look at openness, intellect, and then the Big Five aspects breaks that, non-surprisingly, into openness or intellect, and I have opposites here as closed and non-intellectual as a way to look at it. So this is really measuring, how much you seek change, or just how open you are to change, as well as how well you see new patterns. So this can be openness to experience, which is sort of how do you react to novelty, and it can manifest in a way that we would consider to be intellect or intellectual, which is about sort of pattern recognition and how easy is that, and what is your affinity for seeing new patterns. So openness to experience is novelty, and intellect is seeing across layers of abstraction, and that's that whole pattern matching thing. So somebody high in OI, and keep in mind that OI is not the same as IO. It's not industrial or organizational, it's openness, intellect. People high in openness, intellect, tend to be creative, and tend to see the benefits of change, certainly along the openness aspect. And people that are low, often like the tried and true, and they see the cost of change. And it should be obvious that both of those bring benefits to a group. I mean, you want somebody that's like, hey, let's do this, let's try this, what could go wrong? And you want somebody that's like, no, well, a lot of things could go wrong, and what we've got is just fine. and to some extent, this manifests itself in conservative and progressive behavior. So, we always have conservatives and progressives everywhere at all times in any group. Often competing binding narratives sort of sink into one side or the other if you get an opportunity, right, or for better or for worse, and it's mostly for worse, for camps to form along these dimensions where you have highly open people and highly sort of closed people. And then if you can get sort of orderliness of conscientiousness can lend itself in many ways to being closed. If you're low in openness and high in orderliness, that can make you like really conservative in your thought processes. And so to be conservative or to be really progressive is a sort of a meta manifestation of some of these dimensions. And unfortunately, what then happens is they get these ideologies often compete, which are like baby religions, and because people need a damn narrative. And so, a conservative-minded person ends up having this narrative that fits their world, and a progressive-minded person has this narrative that fits their world. And these narratives the two narratives don't line up, and often they don't even have the same axiomatic assumptions. And so then you have incompatibility, and then it looks like you're having a war over truth. And get on social media right now and you can see it manifest. Get on cable news and you can see the camps. And it's important to, as you witness that, is to pull back from it a little bit and recognize what is really at play. People don't have ideas; ideas have people, and you'll have people that are more open, and you'll have people that want the tried and true. And we have to have both in order to weigh. That's the yin and the yang. That's the to some extent a chaos and order thing. And that you want to be able to look at what works, and you want to be able to look at what might work better, and you want to have some arguments, because what works might not work at all times, and might not work in every way, and it needs to be remade. So this is always at play. And it isn't just about openness intellect. It's manifests across lots of dimensions. And there is no like, this is the dimensional set that makes you a conservative, or this is a dimensional set that makes you a liberal, because unfortunately conservatives and progressives, like I said, they're so sort of cross-pollinated with competing ideologies that there's no like clear map to a specific personality. There's sort of a mixed attraction. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic. We'll talk a little bit about cognitive styles. This is really just to expose them to you. They're not the end all be all. And they tend to be dichotomized. And many of them are kind of saying the same thing in a different way. But they're interesting, and they are ways of looking at the way people think about the world. It's how you perceive the world. What are the things you tend to see in the world and recall, and affects how you think. So you could be field dependent or field independent. And again, this is a bonus lecture, so this is for extra credit. So don't worry about if this makes no sense or you don't care, and you don't have to memorize these things. If it is interesting to you, please explore it. You can think of somebody that's field dependent is. That's sort of the object and the background together, the context of things. The object in context, and a field independent is someone that's more likely to see the foreground versus the background. And to some extent, Western culture is more field independent, and Eastern culture is more field dependent, so to speak. And there is somewhat of a left brain, right brain element to this. Again, these are gross simplifications. But field dependence is one cognitive style. Adapters versus innovators. Adapters, they like to solve problems within proven methods, where an innovator looks for new methods. And to some extent, this is like explore, exploit. And even talked about producer scavengers. There's a way to look at producer scavenger as within the person instead of within the group. That's also sort of like an explore, exploit, which is also like adapt what you have, exploit what you have versus explore the new. Convergent versus divergent. This is really inside the box, outside of the box. Holist versus serialist. Holists look for information where they find it, where, serialists go step by step. It's sort of a series parallel element there, kind of. And obviously, it should be obvious if you were listening to the previous bonus lectures. A lot of these things can be looked at across sort of hemispheric, left hemisphere, right hemisphere asymmetries as well. So again, this is just a smattering to expose you to it. Another obvious thing is that people come from different life experiences, and that has told them certain things are more important than others. Your life experience creates associations. What you associate is obviously based on salience, which is to say, the things that mattered in your life create your associations, and those associations end up, they're literally memory links, and you think about those things and you build narratives, and the narratives basically form the stories that tell you who you are, that tell you what happens in the world, tell you what works and what doesn't work, tells you why you should or shouldn't trust this person or that thing, we think we experience reality, but in reality, we really build, so to speak, reality based on what fits our narratives. At least what we think is reality is what fits our narrative. So our narrative and is built on our life experience, but also it's entangled with the story we build around it to construe everything. So everybody has this, and everybody has it in a complicated sort of way, and most people can't explain it, but it ends up driving a lot of differences between people. All right, neurodiversity. Is it a disorder? Is it a deficit? Is it a difference? What do we mean? I mean, this is autism. This is ADHD. Things like dyslexia. There's certainly we talk about mental things that are put under the mental health banner too. Should all things that are different in the way people are wired neurologically, so to speak, should that always be looked at as a disorder or a deficit or a difference? And the neurodiversity argument is that difference. Look at it as a difference, and recognize that the word deficit or the word disorder, is a label applied to something because it's different. So normative behavior. Remember, normative behavior is expected within your in-group. Have an in-group, you're going to have norms. Don't randomly group people together from all around the world on a desert island, as long as they have food and water and stuff. They'll form groups, and they'll form norms, and they'll enforce those norms. It is inevitable, and that non-normative behavior is by definition abnormal. So when people don't follow the norms, human ugliness often emerges. We need them. Okay, we can't function without norms, and we need levels of strong norm adherence in order to have stability, predictability in our society. So all of those things are true, but at the same time, and when we think about neurodiversity, there are people that following the norms are harder. These are sort of behavioral norms. If you want to talk about sexual orientation and that sort of thing, you look at history, we had norms, that basically, made somebody abnormal by who they were, and I think we understand that pretty well now in our society. But we're beginning to think about the way people think, and realize that. What we were previously calling abnormal or a disorder, that might not only be unfair, but it might be inaccurate. And in fact, we may be depriving ourselves of some of the benefit of the strengths that neurodiversity brings. So we're learning that we need to be more flexible. We need to be more intentional about our norms. So the autism spectrum. And I'm a little bit more of a fan of an emerging way of looking at it as a constellation, because spectrum makes you kind of think of it as one linear dimension, and the manifestations of autism are not along a singular dimension. So one competing framework is around the constellation idea. It was still not all that satisfying to me, but anyway, there's a lot of ways in which autism does not manifest, as a clinically diagnosable disorder, but it sure can manifest as difference. So be careful what you label a disorder. And if you want to get into it a little bit. Google autism and refrigerator mothers, and if you want to see how bad things used to be, and some of this labeling of something as a disorder, and our need to have a singular cause for stuff, has resulted in people with MDs or PhDs behind their names ascribing blame to things, and then trying to fix things with drugs or other approaches that we may find we may view in the future that actually wasn't a disorder, because we certainly have a past that tells us that we have been very wrong about this. So and there are other elements here besides autism, and we haven't really talked much about ADHD and other things, but this should give you a flavor. And this is emerging within the workplace now in terms of awareness and recognizing that there's a lot of strengths that come from these things, but there's also challenges. And I could talk a lot more about this, but the point of this lecture is just to give you a broad framework for understanding, for talking about, thinking about, and appreciating individual differences at work. Okay, so that's the lecture. Let's recap what we talked about for individual differences at work. We talked about what some of the common dimensions are, and then we dug into some of those specifically, and we talked about the big 5 personality dimensions and split that up a little bit, and we talked about sort of the pros and cons of the various highs and lows of each dimension. We talked about cognitive styles briefly. We reminded ourselves of how life experience builds our narratives and shapes a lot of our decisions. Arguably, this is every bit as important as one's personality, and it's certainly fully entangled with how you manifest your personality. And then we ended with a short talk about neurodiversity, and so we're at an hour now. So, but any one of these bullets here could be something that we could go on and on about. Now, if any of them are of keen interest to you, I would encourage you to explore them more. Okay, next lecture will be lecture 13, where we are going to get back into the nuts and bolts. And so we're going to talk about hiring decisions. We're going to talk about a little bit more about the employee selection process. Before we were talking about interviewing, but how do you go about actually making that decision? And then how do you determine, what some of those cutoffs are when you're trying to decide between people? And then we're going to get into employment and the law, and we're going to talk about this legal construct of a protected class and legal theories of discrimination. Okay, hope that was interesting, and we'll see you next lecture.